Our final panel today looks specifically at what is focusing the minds of super funds. And earlier we heard from directors and chairs, and I'm guessing that some of what keeps them up at night is also the cause of a bit of sleep deprivation for our fund panellists, who represent three different leadership roles. As investors, they've got very complex decisions to make, not least around the challenges of decarbonisation, the fears of greenwashing, and the role as active owners when some of their members might prefer to sell out rather than stay in, as we talked about earlier. So to introduce our panel this afternoon, Lisa McDonald is the Head of Responsible Investment at Aware Super. I probably have broken the rules and not introduced you in the order you've been told to sit, so sit in the order you've been told to sit, if that's okay. That's all connected to the microphone. Christian Fock, who's the Acting CEO and Chief Investment Officer at Cbus Super, and Linda Scott, who's the Board Chair of Care Super. Please join me in welcoming our panel this afternoon. So there are a lot of things that we've talked about during the course of the day, from the big global challenges to the more day-to-day challenges, I guess, that you all face. So let's start with what you would pull out as the issue that dominates your worry list. Lisa?
Wow, let's start with the hard ones. Thanks, Ali.
We only have to name one.
There isn't one. I think that's the challenge. There's so many issues as investors and as responsible investment practitioners that we are faced with when we think about the retirement savings of our members that we invest in. So there's a lot of talk around the energy transition, but broader than that, it's about building resilience and adaptation into the assets that we have as well. So then you go through, there's the S issues that are then associated with the energy and decarbonisation. If we think about investing in solar panels, and it's been talked about a lot today, but investing in the minerals that we're going to need to support the transition. I think going back to governance and then thinking about governance, have we got the governance right, one in our own organisation as we think through these issues, but have the organisations that we're investing in, what's their governance and how are they thinking through these issues?
And I'm guessing that given your perspective is one as the Head of Responsible Investing, that's why you go through, I suppose, such detailed layers of that conversation. So, Christian, as a CEO, how different is your perspective?
Well, certainly there's a closer connection with the board, but I would say that most responsible investment team members and investment team members also have a very close connection with the board. The other aspect, I think, that we try to sort of have a greater focus on is actually what do our members want, what are they impacted by, and how can that help guide where we might actually put effort. I think there's like a baseline of things we need to be doing, and that baseline keeps increasing. And it's not just around responsible investment issues, it's around expectations around regulation, transparency, solving the world's problems, whatever it may be. And certainly as we have been very successful, it's rightful that people are scrutinising what we do and how we do it. But one of the roles that I can certainly play, and it's very connected with the work that we do with the board, is let's focus back on our members first and foremost. How does that inform it? And then, what do we do to make sure, and they trust us, right? They say, look, you're the experts in this space. In a case, most of our members are in the construction industry, some of them are in mining, some of them in some of the affected industries, but they say, we know our stuff, we trust you to know your stuff, but also we trust you to know us as well.
So let's go to that. What do your members want? That's a huge question. The 18-year-old member is completely different to the 55-year-old member. The member who's interested in the environment is completely different to the person who's desperate about what they're going to be living on. So how do you possibly narrow that down?
We actually ask them,
What, all of them?
No, you do sample groups. And we did ask them about the, particularly around climate. But I think, when you ask them about climate, you have to be careful about the sort of questions that you ask. So when you ask them about, do you care about climate? Sort of, yes, but, we don't want to be evangelists and things like that. But then you dig a little bit deeper and you say, so when we make investment decisions, should we be considering the impact of climate, physical risk, innovation? And you give a couple of examples, and some of them would say, well, okay, yeah, you have to. I mean, we wouldn't build, a building, right next to, close to the ocean line, but actually understanding it, right? Actually, when you talk to them, they're seeing some of those things in the things they do. They're seeing the innovations in the building industry. When you're constructing apartments now, the expectation is that you start to have facilities for EV, right? So when you start to talk to them about the trends they're seeing and also how we have to understand and preempt that and manage our portfolio accordingly, they go, yeah, of course, you need to be engaged in that. Then there are other real important issues that affect them on the ground. So health and safety issues, right? The right to be represented as a union. And they are interrelated. And they just expect us to be on top of that. Modern slavery is a really big thing. It has a big impact in our industry. And our industry is also, really reflective of sort of this, diverse and new Australia. There's a lot of immigrants that have come in that go into the construction industry. So understanding that, really sort of helps you shape and consider the sort of areas that you would like to work with. And I think you would have heard a little bit earlier that we then start to sponsor research to understand things that might impact them. So, transition pathways around energy, how does that sort of work? We invest in things that sort of give us a bit of insight around some of the technology enablers around sort of physical assets and construction. So we try to find an angle that addresses the issue, that helps prepare also and us to understand our members, but also sort of give them sort of practical things that sort of helps them sort of think about how their careers and how their jobs are going to also adapt to a changing environment.
So if I can just circle back to the initial question, which is what worries you, is the worry that you may not know what they want, that you've got to make sure you know what they want?
Look, I think it's fair to say, and I think everyone will say this, and I just described even just within one cohort, which is more the construction side, there's a range of views, there's a range of ages. And so, we, like the government and others, are trying to sort of, acting as a whole, trying to sort of meet the needs of quite a diverse group of people. So it does worry me that if we are not in touch with that, if we're not able to communicate it well, then we lose the trust of our members. But also, if we're not very clear on what we do, then we also see some of these other risks that are coming up in terms of being misrepresented, greenwashing, legal action and so forth.
Which I do want to get to more specifically. But Linda, if I can bring you in here, as the chair, how different is your worry list?
Having trained as a psychologist, I have to say that I work very hard to control anxiety. So and surround myself with great teams in order to not wake up in the middle of the night and worry about things.
So that's the answer for the chair, is you delegate?
Well, I surround myself with great people. I want to say that first and foremost. I think, though, to the heart of your point about the nature of our membership, because of course in superannuation our first and key duty is to consider the best financial interests of our members, and so that is what we do every day. It is of course the case that our membership has disparate views. In my other life, my role is to support the interests of 537 local governments across the nation. they don't agree on that much. So we do have to find a good process to help us understand what is going to achieve the best financial interests of our members. And in the ESG area, how do we do that? That's a particular challenge. And to your earlier point, care super members are predominantly white-collar professionals. We have more women than men, and they have very different income points. So we have women working in call centres, and we have lawyers and architects, so very different professional backgrounds. I think if you were to ask some of our older members, they would speak about the nature of board diversity as one of a question of gender and gender diversity. If you were to speak to some of our 18 and 19-year-old members, they would speak to board diversity being about gender, ethnicity, sexuality. They would speak about a much wider cohort of diversity that they would like us to take action on.
That's probably after they've said, and what's super?
Yeah, that's also correct. So we need to find a way as an organisation to listen to all of that, to take it on board. And I think you do risk, when you're thinking about the best interests of your members as a whole, you do miss the individual. There's a risk of that. And so as a board, one of the things we do is to start each board meeting by having a director speak about a particular member that they know. And they are tasked with just having a quick chat to them before the board meeting and saying, what's working well for you at Care Super? What do you find a bit challenging? Give us your feedback. And we start every board meeting focused on an individual director. And when you come into our offices, we have photos on the wall of our actual real members who are people. They're not sort of marketing stock shots, and they've got a little quote about what they like about Care Super, or what they think about Care Super, or what's important to them. And so I think that balancing the needs of the collective member with the needs of individuals and remembering that they all are individuals is a really important task for every board.
But also a massive challenge,
yes.
I think everyone recognises. You touched, Kristen, on greenwashing before. So let me ask you, all of you, being in leadership roles, we've talked today about the role that ASIC's now playing and the regulatory focus on greenwashing. And I wonder whether that has changed how you look at your own decarbonisation strategies. And again, Lisa, I'm sorry, I'm going to come to you first.
Okay.
Winner this afternoon.
So I might touch on how we think about it from I think the ESG and responsible investment perspective, and then I'll go into decarbonisation specifically. But misleading or deceptive conduct in terms of our products or services is not new. So that has been around and been a requirement for a long time for us to think about. So ensuring the product disclosure statements that we put out, the material that we put out to our members, that our product says or does what it says it is doing. So, the term greenwashing has come in more because, and more recently because of the energy transition and how we're trying to decarbonise. But going back to ensuring that our communications are signed off by legal, they go through rigorous compliance and risk assessments.
This was a point the Minister made earlier this morning. It shouldn't come from the marketing department.
Correct. The other way that you can ensure, or I guess another added layer, is around assurance or certification. So the fact that you can have your product certified by the Responsible Investment Association, having been audited by them for some products that we have, it's a very rigorous process that you go through to ensure what you're saying you're actually doing in the portfolio. So I'd encourage everyone, if you haven't, which I'm sure everybody has gone through all their disclosure material and thought about it from a risk and compliance perspective. We published back in 2016 our first climate change adaptation plan. We published it in full in terms of the thinking, the science, and why we're focused on managing the risks and opportunities of climate change. So being very transparent about why we're doing it. That's evolved over time, and getting better at communicating our story on how we're doing it, why we're doing it, and what the impact is of that. is where we need to get to and where we need to be better at, and being very transparent. But with that, though, comes some challenges because we rely on a lot of in other data, information. There'll be assumptions made, and we have to make assumptions because we don't have all of the information. But we want to ensure we're managing the risks and we're managing the opportunities appropriately. So, you know, that balance of transparency, that balance of being held to account, but also, I guess, giving us the opportunity to tell our story and how we're going to get there, knowing this is not going to happen overnight. It's going to take some time and we need to go on that journey.
I'm curious, when you did the audit, and I'll ask the others this too, did you change anything? Did you go back and say, actually, that sentence may not be quite able to be backed up, let's just take that out?
So we went through the website and we went through our product disclosure statements and our annual reports. We also asked our marketing team to provide us every bit of collateral they had out in the market. We were surprised with some of the collateral that hadn't gone through a sign-off process, so that has made us revisit our sign-off processes internally. There was some language that was changed, and what we looked at, particularly for our products that have screening in place, that say we exclude this, or we were making sure that it was very clear there were materiality thresholds and what they were, and being very clear on that. So it was more about fine-tuning the language to make sure it was very clear what that product did.
Kristen, do you see also this challenge? And again, we don't have mandatory reporting yet, but it's coming. We don't have mandatory global standards yet, but they're probably coming. Do you see it as a very difficult and challenging period for investors at the moment? Because you're in this sort of, you know, you've got the regulatory structure, but you don't necessarily have all your other bits.
Yeah, I think one of the things that we've tried to do is to have a look at global initiatives, try to align where we can actually see that there's some standardisation. So we have sort of already been participating in certain activities like TCFDs, and we know that the reporting will be leveraged off that, so forth. So in some ways, if you voluntarily sort of move to those standards, you get to learn, you get to improve. And TCFD frameworks are actually about that sort of improving of the information each year. So that's something that we have proactively done. We've had assurance done on our work as well, so that's important. But you know, you don't underestimate the benefit of collaboration and working with others, and also working, you know, with groups that actually help shape and inform these things. The one thing I worry a little bit about, and we have to get this balance right, is if I were to go to one of my members on a construction site and I say, don't worry, we follow the taxonomy, they'd look at me like I'm an alien.
So it's a safety standard. They'll get it then.
Yeah, well, I think there's a translation that we need to be able to do.
Forget your construction site. I'm going to fess up. I had to look up taxonomy. It is not a word that is in the common parlance, and it's usually to do with organisms.
Yes.
So go.
Yeah, it's actually come from the scientific community, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And to be honest, when I first heard about it quite a few years ago, I had to look it up too. So we are very. It's very easy for us to use that jargon. So it's very important for us to also sort of give examples and stories that we know are true, right? To actually bring things to life. And so we have this balance of making sure that we meet all the requirements, and for all those people that want to nitpick and go through every single stock that we have and make sure that we're doing what we're saying and that we're able to do that. But we have to gain a confidence in how we convey what we're trying to achieve. So if you look at things like net zero, that's about having a portfolio aligned with Paris sort of aligned carbon sort of reductions. But then we sort of go, what are we trying to achieve in there? And it's not really about just having a portfolio that looks a particular way, because it doesn't change things. You might have a loose sort of association with that, and making sure that you're not, misaligned with the economy, but there's many other mechanisms for us to think about risk. Ultimately, it's about, well, actually, how do we think about this issue, make sure that we're sort of looking at the opportunities in our portfolio and thinking about, well, how do we think about how our money is sort of taking advantage of those opportunities, but potentially also doing something impactful in the real world. And so now we're trying to sort of, take that framework, which has a lot of risks if it's just sort of taken as one thing only, and we're trying to create a bit more of a nuanced discussion around it. We've got to talk about the fact that we don't have all the information. What we're really trying to drive is real change and invest in real opportunity. So that might mean from time to time our carbon footprint actually goes up because we might find an opportunity to invest in something that's more carbon intensive, but by investing in it we drive it down. So that storytelling and that clarity around not just sort of what your commitments are, but what's the reason for it and what you might expect, I think is something we've got to do more about. That'll also help protect us around the greenwashing aspect.
But Linda, even at board level, that's the big issue, isn't it? Bringing in the complexity so that I've done a number of things with UniSuper, which has been very much under attack from some of its members about holdings, as other funds have been. But it's trying to explain, and I'm not sitting neither here nor there on that, but it's trying to explain the complexity of it, and that you're staying in for a reason. It's trying to explain what good stewardship is. How much of that is on the minds of boards of super funds, do you think?
I think what's on the minds of boards of super funds, again, is our members' best financial interest and how to achieve that. And I respect...
But can I just interrupt there? Because if you're going to say best financial interest to someone close to retirement, they'd say, well, you hold Santos because they're going to go up 40% this year, and that's,
I respect that there are advocates in this space. I mean, I'm an elected representative, again, in other roles. My job is to advocate on behalf of councils to the federal government. I respect the role of advocacy and the need for that, and the importance that can achieve in producing outcomes, for the financial interests of members of my fund. So I think it's important to articulate that is an important role. I also think that it's important to understand the tension, and this is a critical issue that boards think about, especially in relation to regulators, between short-term and long-term outcomes. And, to Christian's excellent point, as an individual, if I were to think about investing in solar panels for my own home to achieve personally less emissions from myself, of course, those would have to be manufactured, emissions would go up, I would have to purchase them, costs would go up, but over time, emissions and costs would go down. That is a lumpy personal journey to get to a decarbonised outcome, which is one that we are seeking to achieve at Care Super. So how do we communicate that effectively to a point where our regulators feel comfortable that we are being honest? How do we communicate that to our members? How do we communicate that to advocates? How do we bring everybody along with us on the journey? Well, that's really hard. That's what is the difficult part of the process. But to be blunt, for Care Super, the meaningful part, thinking about what we want to do for our members, how we achieve it, in terms of investment and our own behaviour and voting in other organisations, that's the interesting part where we're all very aligned. But communicating that and making sure that the regulators are comfortable with that, that's a real challenge.
There's another part to this too, obviously what you do and how you communicate what you're doing, but also, Lisa, the companies that you invest in. And this was touched on earlier, but I wonder whether you see an issue potentially with green hushing. I would have thought, well, mandatory reporting is going to really get in the way of any green hushing, but we're not quite there yet. But do you think, does that worry you? And do you worry about quality of information that you're getting and you're making judgments on?
So I think as practitioners, we're sitting here hoping the ISSB and the standards being adopted internationally solve all our problems for data coming from companies. I'm not quite sure we've got 5, 6, 7 years to wait for all of that to sort of wash through. And in the meantime, what do we as investors need companies to report? And the critical part in that is, what do we as investors to make an investment decision need from a company for them to disclose and be transparent? A company has to report for many stakeholders, but there are different things that investors are going to want versus what their other stakeholders may want. So we're very much focused on ensuring companies are providing the information we need to make an investment decision. I think the other piece in it, though, as well, is we appoint over 100 fund managers to invest our members' money on our behalf. So that interaction and engagement with our fund managers on where they're investing, why they're investing in certain companies, and what they're engaging companies on is aligned to what we as the ultimate asset owner and beneficiary as the ultimate owner is also aligned, and we're engaging and we're asking for the same outcomes of the companies that we invest in. We haven't seen companies pulling back. I think what companies are frustrated with is the number of reporting obligations they get asked to do. They want one framework, they want one consistent framework that they can report under that is going to solve for all of their stakeholders, and I'd love to see us get to there, but the ISSB will go some way. It's just going to take some time. And in the meantime, we're in this, this world of what do we disclose, what do we not disclose. And I would hate that we stop disclosing for the fear of, it not being what one individual may not like.
Christian, what do you think?
Yeah, I've got a couple of... look, I reflect on the fact that AXI is almost 22 years old now. I was, my role at the time when it was established is I was the investment advisor, and so I was there when Mavis Robinson and others were talking about the establishment. The thought of asset owners voting their own stocks was quite controversial and a bit sort of frightening, scary. We come today and we actually do it quite routinely. The issues that we're actually pursuing are much more sophisticated, more complex. We've built, I think, an understanding around how we navigate those things. I think, part of the problem though is that we've done this over 22 years. And we've started to sort of work out how we work best with different organisations. It's not something you engage once and then it's done, and people don't quite appreciate that. But I think, the world's going to get more complex. We're going to have to keep adapting. And it's our role to be able to sort of help navigate that. I've had to go through two House of Reps inquiries, almost got pulled in front of a Royal Commission, multiple audits and reviews from different regulators. So that's just part of the business now. It does worry me, though, that you spend too much time actually protecting your own self and not doing things. But I've sort of formed the view that as long as we continue to invest in what we do, hone and become more sophisticated, then we can also sort of defend against those things. The alternative is that we retreat, but actually that's almost guaranteed to get us into trouble, because we'll be seen as not exercising our responsibilities, our duties on behalf of our members.
Yeah. Can I just, because I think the problem we're going to have is, or thinking of the 22 years of engaging with companies, what if we weren't engaging with companies and raising these issues and asking them to improve? We need to be able to engage. We need to have the trust of the companies. And we have had outcomes and we have had improvements, and it takes time. but, you know, we're always asked to prove the outcome. What does that mean? And I sometimes sit back and think, well, what if we weren't? I'd really hate to think of the world we'd be in if, as owners, we weren't challenging and engaging with companies.
Not to speak ill of those who are no longer in the room, but I did think when I asked my directors panel this morning the extent to which the focus on ESG has changed the boardroom conversation, and everyone said, well, no, it hasn't changed the boardroom. But I'll bet it has. I mean, you know, there's nothing like focusing the minds when you've got investors on your door, you know, every couple of months having a conversation.
Having personally, because at times when the issues are serious enough, you personally get involved at the senior level. It reinforces the work that the team does, and also that organisations like ACSI do. It does get their attention.
Which actually, I wonder whether the extent to which super funds already collaborate on this, and I guess there's different levels of collaboration, but in that sort of big picture stewardship role, Linda, is there room for more collaboration?
I also serve on the board of ACSI, so I'll make that disclosure in saying that actually I think they've done just a brilliant job in getting a balance of the need for us all to, of course, have individual director responsibility and individual fund responsibility mixed with the ability to collaborate where we can to achieve outcomes for the membership. That balance, I think, has been worked, as Christian has rightly said, over 22 years, and it's now very nuanced and I think proceeds in a really effective manner. I think where there's better room for collaboration is with the Commonwealth Government. And I say that because, you know, just like a board has to set the right settings to achieve an outcome for management and staff, I think the Commonwealth Government identifying the areas where the policy settings would be most useful to achieve the outcomes and prioritising their enormous workload in a really transparent way so we could understand that, that would be of great use. And I say that because, to your point about green hushing, you know, balancing that short-term regulatory imperative that regulators have and governments have with electoral cycles versus our imperative for long-term investment to achieve long-term returns, that's a real challenge. The more that governments are able to articulate the benefit of that long-term scope, regulate in that way, think about that, it's really helpful. It gets us to achieve the better outcomes. Green hushing and greenwashing are one area where it's relatively easier to regulate than others. There's all these other spaces in ESG where it's actually much more difficult to regulate. And as fund boards, we also have to very much have a focus on that. And to Christian's point, when a regulator, you know, sends you a letter or comes knocking at your door, thankfully that doesn't happen very often at Care Super, but we do consider it. I want to be very blunt about that. But we also need to balance our time around the board table with those areas that are intrinsically more difficult to regulate but are just as important in the ESG sphere. But
I guess you're not, is it fair to say you're not really getting that clarity of focus from government, are you? There's an enormous amount of ambition for superannuation at the moment.
I think it is happening at a pace that is fair given the time that the current federal government has been elected. You know, I share their ambitious need for change given the period of inactivity. I'll try to be very politically diplomatic, but, you know, I share their ambitious need for change. But I think identifying the order, giving us advance notice of that, helping us to understand their priorities, helping us to understand as funds what the government thinks they can do collectively. For example, you know, the work on taxonomies is really fantastic. We really want to work with the Commonwealth Government on that, understanding how they might look at the, you know, different occupational paths in the just transition. We want to work with them on that. You know, what will their order of priority be? That would help us to understand the things that then we will need to do as individual funds because the government's not yet going to do them?
Yeah, I mean, look, I'll give the government a break. It's been less than 12 months. And
Yes.
the amount of activity and progress in less than 12 months and engagement has been...
But would you like also to have this order of priorities?
Yeah, look, I think, you know, I'd like to see the sustainable finance strategy. I think that might help. I know, I mean, like we have been proactively doing work around transition pathways. We've identified they're sort of necessary if they're willing to sort of take that work and leverage it. And they seem to be quite willing. They've taken a very pragmatic approach that if the industry, you know, has sort of thought about things very carefully, more from a system point of view, have considered sort of interoperability between us and other countries, they have shown a very strong desire to take things that are there and run with it rather than try and impose. So if they continue to do that, I think that would be really positive. The simple fact is also, when you look at taxonomies, if you look at other jurisdictions, they took a long time to do it. We have the opportunity to actually learn, you know, don't make their mistakes, learn from it. So, and the international sustainability standards is another good example. So it feels like there's not enough clarity, but, you know, having talked to my peers overseas, they say the same thing. So I think this is a common problem. The comfort I have, at least, is that the current government is engaging and actually, you know, making, you know, I think practical decisions in what I think is quite a timely manner.
A couple of questions from the floor here, and at least if I can give you this one. Do you think more active stewardship goals and targets will appear in mandates with your investment managers?
Really good question. I was asked something similar this morning around mandates and what we put into them, particularly as we think about investing for sustainable development and in line with the SDGs, and would that go into mandates? We already have, with a number of, or in our mandates, clauses around the fact that we want them to consider ESG integration and be stewards of capital, so to do engagement and to do voting. We have some voting rights that we've taken off of our managers, but we want their views. So that's already embedded in a lot of the mandates that we actually have. Given we have a stewardship program ourselves, I think us getting better at defining our targets and outcomes and milestones and what we're trying to achieve around the themes, we need to sort of set that course first. We have a lot of dialogue with our fund managers, particularly on stocks. They're making the investment decisions, how aligned, and are they engaging on the same issues? And that's, we want to go in with our fund managers in some cases to show that alignment to companies. It's amazing how we're still hearing companies saying no one else is asking me that question or what we're doing on that. So I think it will evolve. I think, you know, us setting the targets and us getting alignment with our fund managers is critical and important.
Christian, let me put this one to you. What constitutes a material ESG issue when you're also considering what's important to members and considering investments across the different time horizons, which goes back to the question we were talking about earlier. But so how do you judge the, you know, the materiality of the ESG issue?
Yeah, look, I think there's a couple of things. I mean, look, you could go to what's your exposure, and I think they're important things as a guide. But sometimes, even if you've got a small exposure, the issue is, you know, quite big and wide-ranging. And so Duke and Gorge, for instance, was a good example. You know, we didn't own, you know, majority or even 5% stake or anything like that, but it was material enough for us to put our weight behind it along with others. And materiality and the issues changed. So cyber, I was actually quite surprised sort of 5 years ago when that was actually considered an ESG issue, to be honest. But I think that's the wonderful thing about when you look at this space. It's actually identifying risks and issues that, you know, today have not been properly considered but are really important. And so now, and if you haven't had a visit from the regulator, cyber is a very big issue, right?
Yeah.
And rightly so. But then there's also things that so for us, it comes back to what's important to our members. So there's the things that's got a lot of traction, and climate is getting a lot of traction. I think that's really important. And so when we think about that, we go, okay, well, we need to really be part of that. But what are the things maybe that aren't being considered or elevated as much? And how can we lend our voice to that? So the modern slavery aspect and what we do around our reporting, we've sort of tried to do a lot more on that. It resonates more with the risks that sort of affect our membership. For us, we've been a big, strong advocate around, the payment, because within the construction industry, it's very common for subcontractors to be sort of run on a lean basis and often delaying payments and things like that. And so, the workers just having the basic right to be paid for the work that they've done is a really important thing. But we look at that safety issues in companies is something that we've done, and we do a lot more focused work on. Even though it's quite a big issue in the construction industry, we see it in other companies. So we've taken a bit of a cue on the things that really sort of matter to them to also help guide that. And one of the nice things about sort of an industry fund is that some of us can use sort of our own expertise and insights to drive an issue and share it with others, and we can get a lot more done that way than if we sort of had to agree on just a common set of things. So that's where the opportunity is around, can we collaborate more and so forth.
One thing that we haven't talked about very much, but we have touched on today, obviously, but this extraordinarily uncertain economic environment and what that means for returns. The specific question from the audience is, do the RBA's rate hikes risk tipping Australia into recession, and if so, how are you preparing for it? Linda, I want to put the question to you, and I know I'm not necessarily asking you to be an economist here, but I am curious as to how much of the boardroom conversation is currently focused on just the known unknowns and the unknown unknowns.
It's a great question, and for full disclosure, again in my other role, I attend from time to time meetings of the treasurers and the National Cabinet and other discussions. So I sit in a number of interesting boardrooms in addition to the Care Super boardroom. But in the Care Super boardroom, we absolutely ensure that there is time set aside to consider those kind of global factors. And when we have board retreats, which we do each year, we typically also hear from speakers, look to evidence that is being published on these factors. I also, coming back to how we can link our own ESG practices with those that we advocate for, think that having great diverse boards with people from different industries and very different backgrounds gives us a lot of strength in that space. I absolutely am honoured to be the chair of an industry super fund. I am not a superannuation or even a finance sector native. It is really helpful to have people as directors with great diversity, because invariably they bring to the board a risk from another industry that they've seen that is completely novel for a superannuation fund, and having that diversity helps you to be across the unknown unknowns in a way that is more difficult if you have a set of directors that come from a certain similar background or all come from the same industry.
We are almost out of time, and I don't want to get in the way of these people and a drink. but can I just ask the question of you, Lisa? Do you worry about making returns in the current economic environment? Does that keep you awake at night?
There are lots of things that keep me awake. It might keep my CIO up a little bit more than I do. But I think as part of the leadership team and the investment team, absolutely we are. Where do we allocate capital? How do we allocate capital? Balancing short-term, medium-term and long-term. And, the world changes and things change. And we've seen, things that we haven't had to think about impacting investment decisions. So who would have thought we would have a Ukraine war that has lasted this long? You know, so there are always those events that are going to be shocks. Thinking through how we have a strategic asset allocation and the impacts of where we're allocating long-term should hold. So being confident in the decisions we're making for the long term, knowing there are going to be a number of issues that will, you know, impact short-term performance, absolutely.
Let's just finish with if you had to fill the blank in this sentence, when we look back at 2023, it will be the year of what for the super industry? Linda?
Change.
That's a cop-out. You could say that for any year, couldn't you, really?
No.
But fair enough.
No, I genuinely, the pace of change is exponential, but with the election of a new federal government and the global volatility, this is more, you know, the pace has picked up.
Fair enough. Christian, the year of what?
I'd say adolescence. Right, we've gone from sort of a fairly young, almost hiding under the radar. We're now very visible. We're tall and lanky and got acne. We're not perfect, but we're finding our way. And I think this is the phase that we're sort of starting.
Yeah, opportunity. Got to be positive. There's opportunity. We need to be focused on the opportunity.
That's a lovely way to finish the last panel for today. Please join me in thanking our panel very much for their insights.